Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone, on today's episode, I chat with Rebecca Ching. Rebecca is certified in the Daring Way and in IFS. I thought about calling this episode IFS Meets Brene Brown, as Rebecca brings us her expertise in both. Obviously, we talk about shame and trauma and vulnerability. I mean, how could we not talk about these things? Rebecca introduces us to what she calls the Unburdened Leader, who is trauma-informed, compassionate, and resilient. And this leader leads from the 8 C's of self-leadership: curiosity, calm, confident, clear-minded, etc. Rebecca and I touch on the enneagram, we touch on eating disorders, and we touch on parenting. So we talk about all the things. Lastly and finally, we talk about Taylor Swift. If you haven't seen, Taylor Swift has a newish documentary on Netflix, and Rebecca had put a couple of quotes up on her Instagram stories, and I was like, oh, I have to see that. And so I watched it, and it was actually really inspiring. So Rebecca and I talk about it for about 1 second at the beginning, and then we end at the end. I say, okay, we have to talk about this, and she lets me know a couple of things that she learned from it. So I highly recommend that. Also, Rebecca's podcast called The Unburdened Leader is out now, so definitely go check that out wherever you listen to podcasts. And you could also check it out on her website, RebeccaChing.com. Okay, hope everyone's doing well. We also, just FYI, we recorded this at the sort of beginning, middle of March, just so you know the timing of that, since all the interesting things have happened in our world since then. So we talk about that just briefly. Hope everyone's doing okay, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Enjoy this one.
Hello. I am so excited you want to talk about Taylor Swift's documentary. I was like, yes, sign me up.
I love it. Okay, so Taylor Swift just came out with this documentary. It's on Netflix, and you had posted on Instagram some ways that it really touched you.
Yeah.
And so then, of course, I had to watch it because I'm like, oh, what touched you? I want to know. So I'm curious how this thing touched you, and then I'll share what came up for me about it.
Yeah, no, I thought that there's a lot that came up, and I've even in the eating disorder treatment community, there's some interesting things there. So
I know
we've had a lot happen in the last month.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you doing, real quick?
Good. Yeah, I feel good. The weather has changed here. So it goes from like freezing cold and snowy to like the sun's been out. So I feel a little bit like hypomanic. But my son and I have, for 3 days in a row, we went out like adventuring. Like we went walk through the woods, and we went on the beach. And yesterday we did Monday we did another hike. So my hips have been bothering me because I have like not walked. I mean, I exercise, but I haven't like gone for a walk. And so I've been walking on like uneven beaches and uneven like in the woods, and like my hips are like, I'm like, oh. So today he's like, he wants to go to a fork. So I think he's feeling it too. Like, let's go outside. But today's like 50. I mean, let's not get too excited.
And
I live in New Hampshire.
That's right. So like, it's even, I mean, it was like cold. It's like New Hampshire and Minnesota had probably similar winters, but San Diego, it's like been cool for San Diego a lot longer. I'm like, I'm not paying the sunshine tax for this. Come on, let's bring it. But it's like, it's weather wimps you here, but it's cool. How old is your son again?
He's 9.
Well, yeah. Well, there's like like we live by the water. So it's always like, it's this like damp cold. And so And then my house, like they didn't build these houses with insulation.
Oh, right.
So the house is colder inside than it's outside.
Wow.
I
Wow.
know.
It's funny how you adjust to it because we lived in New Orleans for a while and it's just so awful hot there.
Oh,
You get really,
it's
you
so
get really,
sticky.
it is.
Yeah, we can adapt. When I talked to you, which seemed like forever ago, did I have the title of the podcast locked in?
No. So tell me about your upcoming podcast. Tell me about all that.
It's called The Unburdened Leader.
Okay. I want to hear all about that.
All right. So thank you for asking. Very, very excited about the Unburdened Leader podcast. And this is a podcast where, for the most part, I'll be talking with leaders about the burdens they carry, how those burdens inspire their life's work, how those burdens take them out, and how they rise from those burdens and the fruits of what they see. And so we know this isn't a linear process, of course, but I'm going to be focusing on a snippet of these incredible people's stories and kind of talking about a little bit of a narrative that I've been focused on. Because, yeah, and so we've joked with my production team. So we call them like, what are the buckets of burdens? We're like focusing on different buckets of like, we've got your health burdens and your loneliness burdens, your mental health burdens. So we call them Bob's bucket of burdens. And I know we're joking around like, what are your Bob's? And as I'm prepping for my guests, I'm like, I wrote my team. I'm like, people have more than one Bob. And they're like, the story might go a different place, but I think it's just going to be really, really cool. I don't think we talk about like, I'm seeing more and more people, I'm sure you are, like talk about their mental health and talk about vulnerable aspects of their story. But I don't see people really connecting the dots of like the dark side and the light side of these things.
Yes, right.
Show me a therapist that life was just awesome forever and ever, right?
Yeah, right.
So, I got into politics right out of college. I mean, my hot mess of a childhood, I'm like, okay, I'll just change the world to make it better. Duh.
Yeah. Yeah, there is some statistic out there that says that like 90% of therapists have either mental health in their immediate family or their own mental health. Like it's some ridiculous, like really high thing.
Oh, I believe it. It. So yes, I'm really excited to really, and I'm really bringing in the trauma-informed leadership concept, and really destigmatize the word trauma. Because I'm real outside of our circles, I can scatter like my mom friends in like a millisecond if I say words like trauma and shame. Yeah. And so I'm really excited to do that, because if we really care about things like compassion and courage and vulnerability, and we want to cultivate more of those in our workplaces and our homes and our communities, we need to have a high level understanding of what trauma is and how to lead from a trauma-informed posture.
So tell me what that means. Like, what does it mean to lead from a trauma-informed posture?
Yeah, no, and this is something I've been really working on. And for me, one of the core tenets of a trauma-informed leader is self-leadership, is having a self-leadership practice. And so in the IFS world, that's kind of our lingo for that we really are leading from that place of self, from those 8 C's, majority of the time. And we have done the work to unburden and are continuing to do the work to unburden our system so we can sit, if we want to have vulnerability in our workplace, as Brene Brown defines vulnerability, as risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. So if our system doesn't trust us to sit with that, then those protectors are going to overwhelm us and will lead from those parts. So I love talking about these concepts. And let me tell you, leaders have been loving IFS. They're tired of the just change your thoughts, change your life. They're recognizing that to run long game, wholehearted work isn't just between the ears. It's a whole body game. It's internal system and external. The other core tenet and core foundation of a trauma-informed leader is being able to set and maintain boundaries. And that is really understanding where we end and someone else begins. And we talk a lot about boundaries, but I don't know if we operationalize them enough. And just understanding from a IFS perspective, many of the protectors and the burdens we carry are younger. So that security we can offer when we're consistent with what's okay and what's not okay, we really create cultures of environments that, and also to be able to cultivate vulnerability in our own system and tolerate that in others. So again, I go by Brene's definitions of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And those things aren't comfortable. But the more self that's present, the more we can then navigate vulnerability. As Brene's research found, that's the bridge to all that we desire. So love, belonging, creativity, innovation. So I think those are some of the main tenets. And then resilience with post-traumatic growth. So differentiating that ability to recheck ourselves when the curveballs happen. I mean, stuff happens.
Yeah.
And then, but then to also take in what are our key learnings when we're on, as we're navigating a difficult experience, and being able to integrate those key learnings into our life. So those are some of the main tenets of a trauma-informed leader. And then really understanding that what trauma is and what it isn't, and that perfectionism, rejection, a business failure, a colleague betrayal, that it isn't just a childhood abuse situation or a car accident, and that we can't separate the mental health from mindset. That mindset and mental health are actually two sides of the same coin. So those are some of the perspectives of a trauma-informed leader.
That's great. As you were talking, I was thinking, so I wrote down risk, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. And my first reaction was, why would I want to lean into any of that? I'm no, thank you.
Yeah. And I have parts that kind of roll their eyes at me. They're like, oh man, because I'm an early adopter with Brene's community. So I trained in 2012. And so I've been doing this work for a while, but it's one thing to we're good at knowing terms, and we could cite off definitions and be smarty pants, right? And then there's the part of really embodying it. And so the more that my system trusts 2020 me, the more they're like, oh geez, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah, can I have just a little space? Let's go in. And then there's some days I just go, oh heck no. They shut it down. So we have to do some more negotiation. And what I've loved about this process is when I was leading from more of a perfectionist part, or do these bulldoze parts that just get it done, I wouldn't be as respectful. And I would really feel the aftershocks of not respecting the pain that my system was holding, or the fears. So I think, I think my system is now at the point, for the most part, I mean, there's definitely, we can have different levels of vulnerability on that, where they're like, oh geez, yeah. And so it's not something I always just jump in. I think of, we mentioned from Minnesota, and we used to do these polar bear swims, we just jump into ice cold water. And I think that's kind of been my life. And then there's something about growing up and having kids, and then it's not just about me, that I'm like, oh geez, I can't just dive in. So my system it's definitely been activated more. So I'm really appreciative of you noting some of our protectors would go, really? No. But if we take time to say, hey, this is going to be a doozy, this conversation, this investment, just saying this or not saying this or saying no, it's going to activate some things. And doing the time to do the U-turn, the YO U-turn, and just say, we're good. We're good. I need some space here. And then doing the deeper work when my system says I can't yet, then I'm like, oh, it's great trailheads. There's nothing like vulnerability that will just kind of lay out the next levels of work.
Yes, right.
I need to do, right?
Yes.
So I appreciate that feedback, because some conversations I've had with people in the community really think, oh, it's more like this neutral experience and it's good. And I'm like, it's good, but no, it's not neutral. And so I guess that's how I integrate IFS with Brene's brilliant research is that if parts are still carrying burdens or depending on their nature, they're going to be cautious. So it's really their capacity for tolerating vulnerabilities based on their capacity to trust and connect with self. That's how I see it.
I love that. So when did Brene do her TED Talk? Like, when did all that blow up?
Gosh, pop question here.
Sorry.
I think 2010 or 2011.
So how did you get in were you just like, how did you get in so close?
Well, I don't know. I was like the millions of people reading Gifts of Imperfection. I mean, I still have this picture of me at the gym on the recumbent bike with my pencil writing in the margins. And by the way, I just found out from leadership that Brene's coming out with a 10-year anniversary edition, and there's going to be some updates and new questions. So I guess it's coming out in May. So that'll be a really, really fun resource for everyone. But and so I just think I'm like, this is stuff we've known intuitively as clinicians, right? But there was language and research.
Yeah.
It was like that concretized what we knew. This is a conversation I've had with anyone who's really connected with her work. And so I just went and researched. I'm like, I want more. And the first training she did is actually when I expanded my brick and mortar business. And so then I got on and went to the second one, summer of 2012. So that's all.
So tell everybody all the things that you do, because you have a lot of balls in the air.
Well, us therapists, but I think I kind of see it as scaffolding though. So grad school, I remember wanting to figure out what are the most difficult issues to treat. Where are people stuck? I didn't want to be bored, and I also deeply passionate about women's issues. Eating disorders and trauma just came to the surface. So that's really where I focused. And shortly after my grad school training, where I had a beautiful foundation in systems theory, particularly structural family therapy, which I think is where IFS makes so much sense to me too, with Dick's background. So it's very intuitive in some ways of how it's foundationally laid out. And then I dove really deep into EMDR therapy. And I really love that approach. And while there's aspects of it that philosophically are not on the same page with IFS, it's a beautiful framework to understand the mind-body connection. It's so collaborative. It's so client-centered. It has a beautiful body of research. And so I couldn't imagine my early career without this methodology. And then I dove deep into becoming a certified eating disorder specialist. And now I'm also a supervisor. So if people want that credential, they get to help them. And then certified in the Daring Way and also a consultant with them. So when people get certified there. So I love that consultant piece. I became a WMFT approved supervisor, but that really was born out of really wanting to up my leadership game on how I led my team, particularly those that were in the licensing phase. And so I had some growth edges there. So I sought that out. And then, of course, a certified internal family systems therapist. And then just last year, because of all the requests I was getting from different opportunities just around the globe to do some cool things. And you know how it goes with our license, right? Where we need to stay in our state. And when I consulted with my lawyers, they said, you really need to set up a separate company and get a different certification. And so a few years ago, that sent me back as I was piloting different things. So I got, I'm a certified leadership Hudson coach, which is this really incredible high-end leadership company, training company out of Santa Barbara. And I did that through last year. And so I set up Rebecca Ching leadership coaching and consulting just to have some differences there. So there is a fine line, on the work I do, and I could differentiate and delineate services. So yes, but I think my husband will be really happy if I just pause on those things. And I am in a season of deepening. 17 years into this field.
So, can I ask you a really personal question?
Go for it.
Could you identify like what burden it is that makes you strive and go and succeed and go after the next thing and go after the next thing? Like, do you know what's the not dark
Yeah.
side of that, or
The
what's
shadow or
yeah.
no, that's a beautiful question. A couple of things are popping up. I think growing up in a home that was very chaotic and violent, mostly emotionally, psychologically, and physically, there was an immense amount of loneliness, and then being parentified. And then the polarizations in the external unit, where I was the good one. I was the nerd with the good grades and the captain of the cheerleading squad and an Arab editor on the yearbook and in the honors program and all those things. And then other people in my family were, what we'd see as bad, but just they showed their protectors were showing up differently, the less culturally
Right,
cool
right.
ones, whether it was drugs or alcohol or not doing well in school or hanging out with a certain crowd. So, but I think that at a young age, I knew I didn't want anyone to feel as alone as I did. And
Mm.
reading, this probably sounds, I'm just going to be honest and own the fact that it probably sounds ridiculously privileged, and I'm owning that. But I was really into like reading biographies around the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, and at a young age, and then reading around about concentration camps at a young age. And my father's side of the family is Jewish. So there's this understanding, there's something that I was connecting to and curious about people that just didn't have a voice, or people fighting for something they believed in. I really identified that while I was experiencing my own injustices in my household, feeling alienated, feeling gaslit, and not even knowing what that was. And like gaslight parenting is its own trauma. So not the loneliness and the feeling misunderstood and feeling like, if I can help one other person just feel a little less of that, then so I started that off and working in politics. But that drive to be better, it sometimes could overwhelm, because better meant safer, right? And when I was letting the shame and the fear run, but then this level of work with Brene's shame resilience theory, and then diving deeper into the roots of IFS, realizing my worthiness is never on the table for negotiation. So those driven parts it's not been easy. They do not like to relax, because relaxing means you're not safe. It's dangerous. And that the more armor or protector that you have of accolades or achievements or whatever your thing is, that meant most safe. So it served me well until it didn't.
And how did you know it didn't serve you anymore?
I think one of my crucible moments was kind of this cluster of a period of my daughter getting diagnosed on the autism spectrum, my son being born, and expanding my business, and being in my mid to late 30s and going, oh, this is a lot.
Wow.
And again, none of those things were bad. It was just, it stretched me. And when my husband and I realized, okay, how do we want to do family? How do we see, now we have this kind of term, we have another capacity of experience in the world in our family. And then all of a sudden that just shed our entire support system, and we had to rebuild it because we said, okay, this is what, with our four walls in our home, this is what we want. And that's when I was just diving deep into Brene's work at that time and beginning my training. And it was it's a holy cow, just, because it's such one of those methodologies that you have to do your own shame resilience work. And we often say in the Daring Way community, shame work is trauma work and trauma work is shame work. And so I think that crucible season, and then having this business dream, and then there's one thing of setting it up, and then there's another thing of running it and trying to do it well. And then going through my own traumas of just trying to figure out how to lead well. And I'd read the statistic in grad school that 80% of marriages that have a kid with special needs or a kid on the autism spectrum end up in divorce. And as a child of divorce, I had this stubborn part, like, we will not be divorced. And I was like, I will not. And so there was this element of pride, and definitely just and again, divorce is not the end all be all. It's not for me, it was this sense of wanting to see things through. That was something that was really important. And I adore my husband and my family. So yeah, I think that season of, and then having your own kids, if there's any kind of trauma when they hit a certain age, so kind of like when they hit the age when the trauma in my life started happening, I was like, whoa, like open-eyed flashbacks happening, and then trying to navigate workaholism and just one thing, again, starting something and then really leading it and managing it. So that was a season. And then just trying to figure out how to care for our kids in a way that was aligned with our values. So that just forced us. And it's been a decade of really refining that. I think we're finally coming up for air and exhaling. And I feel very, very grateful for my IFS practice and my shame resilience practice, and that, and the cultivate the community that our daughter and our son have helped us cultivate as a result too.
What does, I think I know, but when you say shame work is trauma work and trauma work is shame work.
Yeah.
Tell me what that means.
Yeah. So, and it made sense intuitively. I was at one of my trainings and one of the senior faculty had said that. And I'm like, yeah. So, so Brene defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or fear of not being worthy of love and belonging. So let's just pause there. And the way I look at love and belonging is that's oxygen for our soul, right? So if we're literally in our DNA to desire love and belonging, just like we need oxygen and water and food. Then if there's the belief of shame, the physical and emotional feeling of shame says you're not worthy of it, or you might lose it. And so trauma, that's often the residual impact when we have those breaches of trust, especially from people that were supposed to keep us safe. So that's how I see them inextricably connected. So even just saying the word shame, it lights up our brain, And so that's why I'm like such a buzzkill to hang out with. Sometimes some of my mom friends are just like, oh my God, she's so deep. It's like too much. But so
you're like
I
at
think
the third grade birthday party and they're like,
yeah,
where's your hat and your little blower thing?
Yes, I do completely goofball out to the chagrin of my kids, especially my oldest is now into 80s. And so I'm like, oh, I know the words of this song and we're going to go at it. She's just like, Mom. But circling back to shame work is trauma work and trauma work is shame work. So, and shame resilience really is being able to know what the shame is, to speak it. Like if you feel that wash over you, to understand it somatically, and then to have someone for you to to speak your shame story to. And what IFS has been so beautiful about is now I get to listen to the parts speak to me, right? I don't necessarily need the external. It's always better, I believe, when you have that external person. But IFS has given us the ability to lead and to heal and not have to have that be contingent upon the external, right?
Right.
And then, to make sure I'm removed from all forms of communication when I'm in shame. Like, do not text, phone call, do not speak to. Sometimes I need to just be out, and understanding that it can take us limbic, right? And so I just see that one of the insidious aspects of trauma is shame. It's BFF there.
The other thing that you said that I want to hear more about is practices, and the idea of, I think earlier you said something about like self-leadership practices. And so I want to hear about your practices. What does that mean? And what does that look like?
Yes. So and I do this imperfectly. I'm sitting here pausing and hearing a part of me say, yeah, don't be a fraud. You don't have this mastered. So I'm just speaking. So to me, practice is helpful for me as someone who's led from a perfectionistic protector for many years. Practices means I will never arrive until I breathe my last breath. And so one of the practices that shame resilience and IFS have helped me is to be very aware of what's going on with my body. So when I feel that flash of energy, that charge, I now get curious about it, and we know that in both IFS and in the Rising Strong practices, curiosity is a superpower there. And so that sense of what's going on, where am I feeling it in my body?
Mm.
And then depending on the time I have, it's usually what are the fears and concerns, or how do I feel towards it? You know,
Mm.
and so those are some of the questions that we do in the IFS community. And then I get to hear the belief or the story that this particular protector exile's holding.
Mm.
And so I differentiate that from, you know, I am a failure versus, oh my gosh, this part of me really feels like a failure with this news, or man, this part is so jealous of this. Where's the green envy coming? That makes sense. And so I can befriend it. And I'm saying this, that it's not linear, it's not tidy. It's sometimes I call it popcorn. Sometimes if I shed a little light internally, all of a sudden I get popcorned. And so it's just, I really want to, in majority self, I can delight even in all of these parts, and even the parts that society will shame or neglect, the ones that are not as cool. So those practices, that U-turn practice has been a game changer. And then understanding my shame stories, that what Brene had found in her research is that we all feel shame. And this is my little joke I'll say in my workshops, unless you're a sociopath or a zombie. You're not supposed to laugh for me. Come
Oh,
on.
yeah.
Ha
That's
ha ha.
funny.
Yeah. I know, exactly. Anyways, and so the capacity that we all have shame, but what would trigger shame in you? Thank you. I know.
No,
I
I'm
didn't hold
laughing.
up the cue card. Laugh. What would trigger shame in you wouldn't necessarily trigger shame in me. And we used to kind of be irritated, like, why is that bugging her? You know?
Yeah.
But what shame, resilience, and IFS have taught me is just, oh, that's their system and their story. And sometimes I'm like, oh, thank God that doesn't light me up. Or other days I'm like, oh, sister, yeah, I can relate, too. But
yeah.
So that practice, and then what Brene found also is that shame can't exist in the presence of empathy. Where my brain started really fusing IFS with Brene's life-changing research, game-changing research, is really seeing empathy is a protector. And so when a part of me, my empathy protector, is going to blend a little bit, and if I'm sitting with a client going through grief, and then my protector will blend a little bit to connect with grief in my life and go, oh, yeah. So then shame can exist. The physics of shame can exist. So, but if I'm not checking in, if my system doesn't have compassion for the rest of my system that just connected with that grief, right?
Yeah.
Then empathy is not sustainable. So what Brene found too is that she calls it self-compassion, but that we find that that's kind of redundant from an IFS perspective. But that you've got between two people, you've got the exchange of empathy and this arc, right, of compassion is how I visualized it. But initially, and then with IFS, it was also the U-turn of compassion of, hey, okay, we just remembered this, or we connected this, and the other parts of you any parts of me activated by me connecting with that. Because if I keep diving in with feeling the feelings, and I'm not checking in with how my system is doing with that, and or if there's burdens I don't know about, they're going to come up. So that practice of empathy isn't sustainable without the self-led compassion. And that's what I instead of self-compassion, I talk of self-led compassion, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how I integrate them too. My practices are not great with how I want to wrap up my clinical days or my leadership coaching days because of my season of life of going from one thing to the next. I'm doing better at just having space to ease in. Yeah. My old way was booking every minute, and then my nervous system freaked out having space. So I had to build up confidence that my system could trust space. But so those practices of creating more space is another one. So I have time to check in. For me, prayer is really important, and U-turns and checking is a part of that. And that's always been a struggle for me to have consistent practices. But what both IFS and shame resilience have taught me is to really stay curious and befriend what I feel in my body, and what comes out, those reactivities instead of, and I think especially as women, we have a next level of don't be reactive, keep the emotion down. And I did that for so long, especially working in politics and advertising and international youth work, where it was just like, there's one way to be, and emotion and passion were pejorative and weak, and negative and all those things. So I think that U-turn practice, cultivating more space, and that's still a big growth edge for me. Curiosity, especially when someone else's stuff lights me up. When I feel like, oh, hell no, inside of me, I've found that there's gold in the judgment. There's gold in my judgy protectors. That's where the gold is. So, and usually I'm the most judgy about the things I care the most about.
Yeah.
And so I check in, but man, sometimes those judges are afraid to relax. And what's helpful too is I've realized I can have compassion, I can feel empathy, and it doesn't mean it's remiss of accountability and boundaries. And that's what both of these processes together have taught me is to do that too. And the other practice right now that I really draw from Brene's Braving the Wilderness work, that it's like I have my Bible, and then I have a lot of Brene's research and IFS books, and that's kind of like what I circle around. But is this practice of not dehumanizing. And so the parts of me that get really righteous, oh my gosh, I just grew up with so much righteousness. And I think just it's a redhead thing maybe too. I don't know. But like, I'm right and you're wrong, and I want the world to know, right? Or when someone does something horrible, I just practice to remind myself they are human. They are an image bearer. They have a mother, and that is pretty selfish practice. And I tell my clients this too. They're like, selfish, because if I am not dehumanizing and othering somebody, it actually is really good for my mental health and my relational health and my spiritual health. So that's something I really am working hard on, especially in this very polarized, intellectual, bunkered culture that we live in. That is like when my kids will say they suck or he's terrible. I'm like, nope. It's like, he's a bad choice leader,
Right.
But yes. I'm like, I'm super nerdy about it, but I just think we have to do this or else we're falling, it's the hypocrisy in this stuff. It's just, again, but just because I'm not dehumanizing someone doing terrible things, like Holden's like, okay, can we dehumanize Hitler? And I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, the point of this is we're Hitler, so there's deep conversations, but I'm just like, they want to find a way they can blame someone. But when we blame, it's either all them or all me. Right. And so I just think that's one of the best things we can do. And that's where self-leadership helps me stay in and see just the holiness in everyone. And that helps keep me grounded. And it's not giving anyone a pass for saying or doing horrible things or poor choice things, bad choice things, but it's so I can stay true to my integrity. And I do it so imperfectly, but that's one of my practices I'm working really hard on now too.
I love that. I really think it's interesting to think of empathy. So I'm going to back you way up. Empathy.
Back it up.
Back it up. Mm-hmm.
We're dancing. We're backing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're in do you tease up your hair when you're doing 80s stuff with your kids?
I don't have to tease my hair up.
You've got great big hair.
It can fro. I do a lot of different things, but often I don't have to. But yeah, sometimes I will just to be extra for them, a little extra crazy, and get the reactions.
Yeah.
But yeah, so empathy as a protector. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that is really interesting because if someone's telling me a sad story and I'm going to have empathy come up, and then if I can be in self with empathy and hear, because that's going to like tag probably something that's connected to me and my system. And so
Mm-hmm.
then it's empathy could actually introduce me to the exile that maybe is tagged, and then
Hollow.
self can then be with that. But what happens for me probably a lot is there is no space because I've
Mm-hmm.
got some pretty amazing managers. And so I won't know. This actually happened to me a couple weeks ago where all of a sudden I came home and again, right, I'm like you, I go from like work to pick up the boy, then I'm home, da 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 da. And I was home and all of a sudden I was just eating everything. And I was like, wait, what's happening? And then it took me a minute or two to realize I had heard a horrible story earlier in the day and I
Mm.
just didn't, it had to just kind of go in a container and I just didn't let myself no space for those parts of me that were so, had so much empathy, but then there was some rawness there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, I guess I'm curious about this idea because when you said that, I thought, interesting. I think I would have thought empathy is part of self.
And I remember asking Dick Schwartz about this, the founder of IFS, briefly. We were like at a training and I was like peppering my questions. And I got the impression that it could be both from
Mm,
him. And it wasn't this definitive thing. But in terms of just a general conceptualizing and how I integrate the two models, um, but again, if we look at how Brene defines empathy, it's connecting with a difficult emotion in my system so I can connect. So there is a part that helps me blend with that. And then I have compassion for the person sitting in front of me, what they're feeling, but also for myself and my system for connecting with that emotion. And
mm.
so again, it's a framework. It's not the gospel in the only way,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it feels, because the difference between empathy and compassion, they get used often interchangeably, but to get granular though is to sit with suffering and just to be moved by someone's suffering. and and then
Mm.
empathy, I find, especially in helping professionals or for those that are enneagrams in the house, the twos and probably other ones, I'm not super versed on that, but
Are you a one?
no, I
What
thought
are,
I was for a long time. What do
yeah,
you
what?
think? I know you're not supposed to guess, but what do you think? You thought I was a one.
I thought you were a one. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I'm a three.
you're a
I'm a
three.
three. Yeah,
I'm a three
yeah.
too. Which could
And I love
explain
my
part of
threes.
your drivenness, right? Your go, go,
Mm-hmm.
go. Yeah.
And the shame piece. And yeah,
Yeah.
but, but what I love though is because I think sometimes too, and I was having a conversation with a colleague who's trained in IFS too yesterday, that often we still exile, even within the IFS community, like, oh, they were parts led. And we still exile parts. And if parts are really all welcome, like all parts are welcome is one of the cheesy mantras, but true mantras we say in
Yeah.
the IFS community. Um, not all systems like that when that's said, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I and so really seeing these managers and empathy as a manager, but when we're leading from that all the time, that's what the burnout, and what Brene said, there's no such thing as burnout. Either you're doing empathy or you're not, you're doing compassion or you're not, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really where boundaries come in. It's either, where do I end and someone else's pain begins to. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
that's just kind of, and because I was trained in Brene's work first, like I knew of IFS and had done some like little amuse bouche of it in my early in my work, understanding,
That's a great
with eating
word.
disorder
I
parts.
love
But
that word.
I know
Yes.
it's such a good
It's a
one,
good
but
one. Yeah.
I think it's not that I lay on like more one or the other. It's just because it was foundational, and
Yeah.
my own developmental
Yeah, and
curve
it's
as a
right,
therapist.
right. Like that was the foundation, and then the IFS, you were like, oh, I can take this understanding and understand parts and all that on top of that.
Well, I often say shame resilience clears the way, and IFS is the roots that helps me maintain my shame resilience practice.
Can we shift and talk about eating disorder work and how you're using Brene's work with IFS with eating disorder clients,
Yeah.
or how you think about eating disorders?
Oh gosh. I think we are struggling in the treatment community. I remember when I first started getting my certification over a decade ago and meeting with some of the like original leaders in this community, publishers and activists. and asking, hey, what's changed in the 30 years you've been involved? And they're like, nothing. And, like the cheerleader parts of me were like, wah, wah, wah. And now that I'm wrapping up my 17th year as a psychotherapist, I can see what they mean, because it's a big business. I remember going to my first eating disorder conference and saying, oh my gosh, there's so many treatment centers here across the country. And this one woman said, yeah, about half of them used to be drug and alcohol, and they've changed. And I said, oh, she's like, Mike, why? She's like, there's more money in eating disorders. And I was like, oh. And so early on, I was hearing some of this stuff. And I remember being at my first time I went to level 2 as a participant for trauma neuroscience, when Dick Schwartz was still co-leading that with Frank Anderson. And we were wrapping up, and I was talking kind of how we do we're entering the community. And I'm like, man, doing this eating disorder work and going back and having the posture of an IFS therapist where all parts are welcome, and hey, yeah, the part's going to starve, the part's going to binge, and not exiling it or getting into a power struggle, but still honoring standards of care, ethical standards of care and safety. It's this weird tension. He said to me, I failed the eating disorder community. And it took my breath away. So I'm in a room of like 30, 40 people, and he's going to be on my podcast, and I'm going to be talking to him about this. And so I think we're living in a culture that just the disorder eating spectrum is more normal than not. I'm particularly passionate about orthorexia, which is the obsession with eating healthy. And so we often hide our disordered obsessive protectors behind health, and especially if someone looks a certain way and is engaging in certain behaviors like fitness, and depending on their body size. But we have so much stigma around size. And even within the eating disorder community, there's so much bias towards researching more of the restrictive aspects, than people of size. And they don't understand people that are larger bodies can also have more restrictive eating disorders. And so I think we're at a really powerful fork in the road, as there's a lot going on in culture as a whole, how we look on healing. I think it's been stigmatized as a certain archetype of who gets eating disorders and who doesn't. But having worked in advertising and politics, what's the number one emotion that gets us to take action?
Fear.
You got it.
Is that right?
So you think of billions of dollars spent for us to feel afraid or ashamed or not enough, so that we buy something or engage in a service. Good marketing even gets me. So, I mean, even in my house, my daughter, she's got managers that are very perfectionistic, all or nothing. She's very concrete, and I've got a whole bookshelf of stuff on eating disorders and neuroscience. So she's been reading this her whole life. And so she knows how to get to me, but, she's very aware of size and very aware of, and has starting to see how culture has infiltrated her no matter what I do or say. And so, but with the parts work, it's been really helpful to not, there's been this movement of goodbye, Ed, get rid of the eating disorder. Let's exile it. To it's here for a reason. Let's befriend it. And no, I mean, unless I'm with my IFS colleagues, everyone looks at me like I have 3 heads. So, and so to say, I'm going to befriend this part that really doesn't want to be safe. And sometimes that means we have to get you to a higher level of care because this part's running the show. And I'm so sorry, knowing what that will mean. And that can often lead to more polarizations internally and externally. And then you've got the insurance where they look at the metrics of, okay, you've met this weight or these behaviors are here, so we're going to boot you. So if someone really just needs more containment and more intensive support, we don't have a system that is happening. And I just saw on social media, one of the women in charge of public policy and activism with NEDA, the National Eating Disorder Association. She's incredible. She founded BEDA, Binge Eating Disorder Association, shared a story. No, it wasn't her. It was an attorney who's really involved in the ED community. There's going to be a huge class action suit filed against one of the top insurance companies in California for denying care. Wow. So eating disorders are the most deadly of all mental health issues. Some people push back on me now because if you include opioids in that, opioids has surpassed that. But usually it's through suicide or heart attack. And so many people are maimed by that. And then so many people just live a life of hating and disconnected with their body. And what I love about IFS is I'm out of the power struggle and I get to understand the whys. And I did EMDR for so long and that was so helpful, but sometimes we get stuck. And so now to really understand these different parts, and it takes time to help even create space for more self-energy if they're not well fed. It's like hard to do that. And then my favorite thing is when people are stable and they really have moved beyond the throes of those parts running their life, to do the shame resilience and the rising strong and the gifts of imperfection, the insight-oriented work, to go, who am I without this leading my life? So that's been fun. But I think the activist parts of me really look at what's going on with food and body stuff and just see the insidiousness of it. And it's very much connected, I think, sexism and racism and just, and socioeconomic disparity. There's just a lot that it brings out for me too.
Yeah. It's funny because I often think, probably because of my own issues and how I grew up, and that if you're thin, then you don't have, I mean, unless you have it, like, you're super thin and then you have an eating disorder, but like, as long as you're thin, then you have no eating issues, or that you're fine, or you're happier, or you're prettier, or whatever that is, just because you're thin. And so there is so much body awareness of, I think that's a really good term, like that, like not just of my own body, but of everyone else's, and assumptions that I make about them.
We do. And to really start to stay curious about those biases that we have towards people of any size and any look. I mean, and I think it's only magnified in a culture that really everyone, it's just so polarized. So there's the external polarizations, mirror the inner polarizations. And when people aren't feeling physically well and are not connected to their bodies, I mean, we know with EMDR work, with IFS work, we know, and even shame resilience work, we know that you have to be able to connect with your body. But if those protectors are up, they don't even want you to connect with, and how does that feel in your body? Some people just can't.
Yeah.
Right. And that's so that's slow, patient, intentional work.
Yeah. Let's talk about Taylor Swift. Tell me what you thought about her documentary.
So I kept having people ping me saying, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this? And I'm like, okay, no. And I mean, Taylor, I've been like I liked her. I like Shake It Off. And 1989 was the year I graduated high school. And I was like, okay. But I watched this documentary and I'm full on, holy cow, a fan, and not even more than a fan, a deep admirer. She had these two quotes that I wrote down, and I found it for our interview today. She said, we don't want to be condemned for being multifaceted. She's talking about women. And check this one out that she said towards the end. And I thought, okay, this is a mantra. I want to give her credit. But she said, I want to still have a sharp pen, a thin skin, and an open heart.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And just, I just, there was so much, and just see her genius in that, and her, like, to see someone making music, like she was doing her passion, and the precision and the repetition and the collaboration and the joy. Oh, we all need to be doing something we love. And she gets beat up so much and criticized so much. But she also has such a huge following. And I loved when she was making some decisions about whether to get involved in endorsing someone in a political campaign. She's like, I can't not get involved.
Yeah.
It was like she was out of integrity staying silent. And I just so valued that. So appreciated that. And so, yeah, there was I'm trying to find the quotes. I had called them up because I like was writing down all these things. She said, I was so obsessed with not getting in trouble and getting shamed for something on any given day. And I thought, that was my whole caseload. That was me.
Wow.
Right. And then when she got attacked for, I think it was around the Kanye West stuff, she said, well, my reputation has never been worse. So you must like me for me. And then this was a good one. When there is an opportunity to change anything, you had better know what you stand for and what to say.
Wow.
And then This is discussing a belief she absorbed and unburdened from the collective fan culture. She said, live out a narrative in a way that entertains us, but not in a way that makes us uncomfortable. She was noticing this kind of like box she was put in, like, entertain me, but don't make me feel comfortable. Like she was dehumanized and objectified.
Yeah.
And she's like, I'm trying to reprogram the misogyny in my brain. And I was like, me too.
Wow.
And so I just, those are my favorite quotes. And I just thought, and we got to see this woman grow up and just really move from kind of parts, really those, her managers protecting her as she was an adolescent. And once she's moving past 25 into true adulthood developmentally. And I just thought, what a gift. And there was a part of me saying, you could just be duped. They could have just edited this really well. And I'm like, you know what? I am not going to do cynicism. Cynicism protector, I would like for you to give me some space because I don't have time for that. But I wanted to exile my cynicism protector. But I just thought it just took me days to really just take in someone giving voice. And I needed to hear that. I think sometimes we get in our heads. And so I just appreciate her leadership, and whether I love all of her music is irregardless. She was stepping into her own and owning her stuff and doing what she loved in a world under a microscope where she grew up. And I have just the deepest respect of people who step out, whether you have millions of fans or you're just stepping out and really stepping into your truth. And knowing that your truth might cause a backlash, but you can't not do that. That's who I want to surround myself with. Those are the people I want to support them in their long-term leadership work. That's who I want to be.
The last thing I always ask is, if you weren't doing all the things you were doing, what would you like to do instead?
Are you talking professionally or personally?
It could be anything. Yeah. It doesn't have to be professionally. It could be whatever. Money doesn't matter. What would you do?
I mean, right now, I'd be entertaining in my backyard. I'm looking at my backyard. We're getting ready to redo it. And we have a huge table that seats 12 people. And I'd be entertaining. I'd be working on my succulents. I'd be writing, and doing everything I could to cultivate a home and a community that is accepting and welcoming and inclusive of my kids. I think that's all I got. And probably dancing. A little more dancing. More dancing.
Yeah, with your big hair out.
Always.
What would you be writing?
Oh, that's personal. I am working on a book on unburdened leadership, and I'm tapping into my own and bringing in my own stuff along with stories I've heard over the last couple decades, and just the power of being unburdened leadership. I think I'm dabbling in some poetry right now too. So I had met someone recently who did that a little bit more and felt some words flowing out of me, and parts of me had shut that down because I didn't have time for that stuff. And so I'm trying to play around with a little bit more of that creative energy too.
Yeah. Well, I think that would come with space and with quiet and with deepening.
It comes out. These moments just usher out. So sometimes I just spur some words in there and doing it just for me right now. So
I love that.
Yeah.
And as a 3, that's a pretty big deal, right? Because as a 3, I know.
I know.
Oh my gosh.
I know. But it's fun coming home. And again, as a dominant 3, I think I've got all those parts. I mean, I'm telling you, my 6 is kind of wigging out lately with everything going on in the world. I'm like, get to Costco, stock up. We don't need the toilet paper, but we need the wipes. So
everyone needs toilet. I don't get the toilet paper thing.
I don't either. Yeah. I don't. I want things to feed well and be clean. But anyways, so yeah, I think I'd be doing that, but a lot more hospitality. That's one of my favorite things.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for your leadership and for you showing up and having these conversations and putting yourself out there. I am so grateful for you and your work.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFSTammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.